Security officials in Israel say 3 of 4 Israeli hostages rescued during a daring military raid by the IDF on Saturday were found in the home of a former Al Jazeera journalist and a Hamas labor minister spokesperson, Abdallah Al-Jamal. Now, to chat about this in more detail is our foreign affairs expert, Lisa Daftari, who joins us once again from the Foreign Desk in Los Angeles. Lisa, was Al-Jamal, who was killed in the incident, by the way, an actual journalist or simply a terrorist posing as a journalist?
Both. And that's the crazy part, right? How many journalists have been actually identified as working for Hamas? And in this case, quite literally harboring these innocent civilian hostages in their homes. Look, there's so many things to break down here. The world's fixation, the different human rights groups who have been talking about and spreading this idea that Israel is fixated on killing journalists. Well, these journalists happen to be terrorists. Secondly, 4 Israeli hostages were rescued, not freed. According to CNN, they were freed. They were rescued in a very, very complicated mission by Israel's army. And there were there's many people who were killed, Palestinians who were killed in the crossfire. Now, the question then becomes, did the neighbors, friends, families of those who are harboring these Israeli hostages not know that they were doing this? This is terrorism. These aren't innocent people if they were actually involved in the abduction and in the hiding of these hostages. Look, we want to talk about innocent Palestinians. We want to hear their voices. We want to hear them calling out terrorism. We don't want them involved in participating in terrorism. And that's going to be really the tipping point of a future of the Middle East. We saw that in the Abraham Accords, where Arab nations came forward and said, this is not us. We want to be a part of the future. We want prosperity. We want to do away with terrorism. And we're going to stand on this line, this side of the line. We want to see the same thing for the Palestinians. If they're living under Hamas, they need to say no and not do what they're doing. They're actually complicit. We saw that in UNRWA, the UN agency that is given money to help the Palestinians, were actually involved in the October 7th attack. Terrorism. That is pure terrorism. And here, a journalist, and you asked, is he actually a journalist? Well, he was published in Al Jazeera and other publications, publications that people frequently cite and quote and look to as real journalism. And here he is, an actual terrorist posing as a journalist.
And you know what I was taught a long time ago, Lisa, as a journalist myself, it's always good to report on the news, but not to be the news, right? There's a huge line. You never ever cross that. Lisa, a new fire has erupted in northern Israel following more rocket and drone attacks from Hezbollah. Now, at this point, do we know if there are any fatalities or injuries?
There have been a handful, one most recently. Look, in the beginning of the war, we saw these rockets coming in from southern Lebanon into northern Israel. Many were at that point evacuated. Many of those went back to their homes. The question of, when this will begin is on the minds of many. It's not if it will begin, but when this will begin. Obviously, Hezbollah, by the command of Iran's regime, is trickling its attacks into northern Israel and escalating in the past few weeks. We saw fires, thousands and thousands of acres of fires in northern Israel as a result of the Hezbollah firing into Israel and really beginning its escalation and trying to provoke. Now, look, there's so many factors here. It's not just the fact that we know that Hezbollah, again, commanded by Iran's regime, or Hamas in the same situation, want to eradicate Israel. It's a matter of looking up their strategy as to when they want to time this out. We're also looking at an election year here in the United States. President Biden and his administration trying to really wash down this the narrative of the war going on in the Middle East. He wants it off of his docket. He does not want this to be his issue. And of course, both sides are very demanding more of the president to do more for Israel or do more for the Palestinians. And so it's going to be interesting because every single one of these issues are going to factor into if that war with Hezbollah starts sooner rather than later.
Lisa, Benny Gantz, the war cabinet minister and former Israeli Defense Forces chief of staff, announced his resignation from the emergency government. He cited some fundamental differences in strategic approach and a lack of progress towards achieving a decisive, amazing victory over Hamas. Now, what does this mean for Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu moving forward?
Yeah, it's not a good look, right? Regardless, it's not a good look. It's bad PR for Israel across the board. Uh, it's no secret that there's infighting between the left and right in Israel. We saw it before October 7th. We saw less of it after October 7th. And now we're beginning to see more of it again. Look, that unity that we had after October 7th, that's exactly what Israel needs to defeat Hamas, to focus on its existential threats rather than its internal conflicts. We continue to see some protests on the streets. Again, bad PR. Israel, the country the size of New Jersey, surrounded by enemies, does not need this internal fighting. Now, Benny Gantz had threatened many times, to Bibi and his coalition to say, if this is not going to go X, Y, and Z way, then I'm out. It's unfortunate. It's unfortunate because you would hope that they would work together. Again, giving this impression of a unified Israel that would stand behind any policy. And I do believe, having studied this area forever, I do believe that when it comes down to it, everybody does agree that Hamas must be eradicated. Everyone agrees on the approach that they took in the aftermath of October 7th, with some small differences. Now, what Benny Gantz is having issue with is what he says is the day after plan. Look, that might be premature. That this might be more of a dramatic move by Benny Gantz in order to secure his political future, to kind of wash his hands from the Bibi Netanyahu era, and to wait until this kind of the fog clears, and then he can come into power once again. We shall see. But again, for the time being, it would behoove Israel and the United States, everyone, to be on the same page and to fight that main enemy, which is that radicalism that is extremely just paralyzing the Middle East. And again, focusing on Iran's regime, focusing on Hezbollah, focusing on Hamas.
The Biden administration, Lisa, has issued a warning in which Lebanon could be flooded with terrorists from pro-Iranian militias coming from Syria, Yemen, and even Iraq. So it wouldn't just be Hezbollah that Israel would really have to contend with.
Absolutely, and that's the plan all along, right? Iran's regime has doubled down in the last decade or more in surrounding Israel with this ring of fire that they call, and they've excelled. They have done what they aim to do, and with that extra money coming in during the Obama years, and now again during the Biden years, they have sold oil up north of $90 billion. They've earned that money on their own because of the loosening of sanctions, because of the money coming in from reparations and other concessions that the United States has made. And that's the danger. We know where Iran's regime spends its money. It's not on the people of Iran. It's on terrorism. It's outside their extracurricular activities in the region. And that's exactly their aim. And again, they were successful in doing it. Houthis in Yemen, insurgencies in Iraq and Syria. You see them propping up the Bashar al-Assad regime. You see Hezbollah in Lebanon for decades now. And of course, Hamas as well. So this is something that the world needs to focus on more than anything else. Here in the United States, we're in an election year, as I said, the border being a major issue. Now, are many of these nefarious actors able to get through the border? Absolutely. We know that many have come up that have been on the FBI's most wanted list, that have been on the FTO, on the foreign terrorist list. So this is something for everyone to keep an eye on, not just Israel. And I think, we have said so many times in foreign policy, it starts in Israel, but that's what we're going to see here in the West very, very soon.
A number of pro-Hamas agitators have surrounded the White House and calling for, quote, dead Jews. Now, Lisa, many of the protesters blocked exits used by the Secret Service, called for the destruction of Israel, so they're not looking for a two-state solution, and even vandalized recent nearby statues. What I'd like to know, though, is how many arrests were made?
Right. And how, my question is, how does this help the Palestinian people if that's truly their cause, which it's not? Their cause is anti-American. Their cause is pro-terror. People ask me, why would are these pro-Palestinian protests, or are they pro-Hamas protests? And it's difficult question to answer, because on the face of it, they want people to think this is pro-Palestinian. But when you're blocking the highway and not allowing people to get to the airport, or when you're holding a bloody mask of Biden and calling for the death of Jews. Death of Jews. It's not about Israelis. It's not about policy. It's not about land. It's about the death of Jews. That's entirely pro-terror. That is anti-Semitic. It is everything but helping the people that are in the Palestinian territories. And I hope that average Americans or Canadians or Europeans, wherever these protests are taking place, are waking up to the fact that this has really nothing to do with the Middle East, but is just an excuse. They're using that as a springboard to destroy and to really just taint the societies that they're in. Burning American flags, what does that have to do with the Palestinian people? Destroying monuments and historical pieces. I mean, what does that have to do with anything? But I think it's just an excuse, and I think that the police should not shy away from making those arrests and really laying down the law that this is not peaceful protest. This is not freedom of speech. It's none of those things, and I think most people are recognizing that.
The United Nations told Israel that it will add the Jewish state to a list of international states and militias that violate the rights of children during wartime. Now, Israel will now be grouped with what, Hamas and the Islamic Jihad terrorist organizations?
Yeah, it's a joke. This is the UN. It's the same organization that promotes Iran's regime to committees of human rights and women's rights, that promotes the Saudi government to many of those committees as well. So, take it with a grain of salt. This is business as usual over at the United Nations. I don't think this is a huge headline, but it's a shame. It's a shame that the world communities, the body of nations, the United Nations can't stand against terrorism and to recognize the difference between Israel and Hamas and Israel and Hezbollah and Israel and Iran's regime, a country which still has its, one of the biggest gay pride parades in the world, that lets women go to college, that lets Arabs live freely. Muslims, Christians, and Jews live side by side in Israel and are thriving. Those who live inside Israel, I've interviewed many of them, are thriving and are extremely happy with their lives there. And I think it's unfair to really, take this aerial view of the war that's going on and not recognizing how careful Israel is in its approach. Look, in any war, any army, no one's perfect. People will die, civilians will die. It is a war. When you look at the experts out there that are studying urban warfare, from a very minuscule, down on the ground approach, not their aerial United Nations privileged point of view, you'll see that Israel is being entirely careful. They're warning people. They're trying to get innocent civilians out of harm's way. It's out there. If people want to get this information, it's out there. Again, urban war specialists who are analyzing the actions of the IDF and coming out with reports. So I would take their word for it over Joe Biden's or the UN or Amnesty or anyone else. I think that if people want the information, that's the place to look.
You know what I've been seeing a lot of as well on social media recently, especially when it comes to the pro-Palestinian protests and pro-Hamas protests, are queers for Palestine. I'm thinking to myself, isn't there a bit of a conflict there? Like, do you think that Hamas would really side with those in the LGBTQ2 plus community? I'm thinking there's not really a good fit there.
Right. Hamas will not side with them or with women or with children, because if they did, they wouldn't hide bombs in schools or in hospitals or in mosques. They wouldn't allow these families, even if they wanted to, volunteer to take these hostages, because then they become part of the war. So they are absolutely using these people as human shields. They're absolutely getting them involved in the war. And really, those casualties are on the hands of Hamas. It's not getting them out of harm's way when they have the opportunity to do so. So again, the information is out there. It's for people to really look in the right places to get the right information, and not the propaganda that is being put out by Hamas or by the UN or by many of these very leftist so-called human rights organizations that are really not promoting human rights in these cases.
Lisa, Alexander De Croo announced his resignation over the weekend as the Prime Minister of Belgium following the resounding defeat of his so-called globalist party. The Open Flemish Liberals and Democrats only garnered 5.9% of the popular vote. So in your opinion, are we seeing maybe a bit of a fundamental change in Europe?
We're seeing a referendum in Europe. What we're seeing is people waking up to leftist policies that sound so great and utopian on paper, but when put into effect are destroying societies, whether it's the lax policies on immigration and the migrants that have come into their societies or anything else. This is a referendum. People are noticing the change in their lives. We saw it in Italy, we saw it in the UK, we saw it in France, and now we're seeing it in Belgium. This is people saying that those are maybe perhaps good policies, but they just don't fit our lives. And it's perhaps buyer's remorse on a lot of these left-wing politicians, and maybe a wake-up call for Europe.
She's our foreign affairs expert and political expert as well, Lisa Daftari. Thanks so much for joining us today from Los Angeles.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.